I'm Kim Bailey and this is Inside Exec. This week I'm going to revisit one of the podcasts that we did earlier in our history. I think this one is from about 2018 and it's about learning from failure, and I particularly wanted to revisit this one because, as some of you know, I recently competed at the Melbourne International Flower and Garden Show, and for those of you located outside of Australia, this is a 5-day celebration of everything that has to do with gardens. And so very much like the Chelsea Flower Show, it has both outdoor and indoor competitions for gardens as well as for floral design. And I was selected to compete in the top level of the floral design competitions. There were 8 registered or selected competitors in that competition. Only 6 of them managed to get there on the day. 2 withdrew just before the day before and the day of the competition, with the pressure being too much for them. So that gives you a little bit of background into the example that I'm going to use as I talk through this learning from failure exercise. That gives you an indication of what might have happened at the competition. But first of all, I'd like to revisit some of the points we made in that original podcast, because that's the basis of what I'm going to use to talk about what happened and what I have learned from that experience. So in the original podcast, we looked at redefining failure as learning. And this is a very trite way of saying that we can access the blame and put it somewhere other than on ourselves. And I think that sometimes we have to take the blame, accept the blame, but also it's not always about blame and blame throwing, as I talked about all those years ago. Failure is only truly occurring if you repeat the exact same actions multiple times and expect a different result. Otherwise, it is simply a learning experience. We need to move past the label of failure to understand the why, whether it was due to market conditions, competition, skill sets, or presentation. And that's in a broader sense. We were talking about both projects and my own experience in that original podcast. What we do need to do is avoid the failure identity. I think this is where I fall into this category a bit. Focusing on the stigma of being known as a failure is crippling and prevents you from moving forward and growing from the experience. And I think that at the back of my mind always, this recent issue will sit until I can move past it and genuinely know that I have learned from the things that I can identify out of the exercise that I should have done differently. In terms of leadership and organisational culture, we talked about giving permission to be innovative, that leaders must create an environment where it's safe to make mistakes. A lack of mistakes often indicates a lack of innovation and outside the box thinking. And I think that the current business environment has taken that away somewhat, that these days, much more so than in 2018, we have to be innovative as organisations and as leaders, because so many more factors come into play in terms of our organisations and our processes than was happening even that short period of time ago. We talked about accountability and apology, that if a project fails, leaders should acknowledge it quickly, apologise for any deviations from the planned process, and engage the team immediately to fix the issue. Now, the team is me, and so I did do that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Openly discussing what didn't work can lead to better team solutions that would never have been discovered if the original plan had proceeded perfectly. And I guess that is what this exercise is about for me on a personal level, is that I'm openly discussing this failure. And I can talk about what didn't work. And as I go through that and talk about it for you as the listeners, I think that I will find solutions that will work for me next time. What we did focus on, as you would have expected, is effective documentation and closure. Now, Fuliana's very big on closing the loop, and she was very adamant that we needed to ensure that there's clear closure so that no individual carries the weight of the blame into subsequent projects or meetings. That is something that I'm working on because, individually it was my responsibility to make this work. And I think that as leaders and as senior executives, we often think that the buck stops with us and that we have to take the blame for failure. And that means that that's a stopping point, that we can't move beyond that if we're not looking at what we have learned from that experience and moving on to the next thing and making sure that we implement what we've learned into the next process that we take on. We should have a 3-point record we talked about. When recording a project setback for posterity, focus on 3 specific elements: what happened, the outcome, and most importantly, what we learned from it. And so that's where I am at the moment. I know what happened, I know what the outcome was, and now I'm trying to clarify what I have learned from that experience, not just on a very basic level of the elements of the project, which you'll understand when I talk about it, but more about the long-term planning and my approach to these things that I need to adjust somewhat. We need to focus on recommendations to avoid a blame culture. Future teams should only be briefed on the recommendations and the areas for improvement rather than the entire history of what went wrong. And this is, I think, where we still have very muddy water. If you're working with a team and someone suggests a new process or a new activity, and there will be others on the team who've tried it, and they'll say, we tried that, it didn't work. The most famous words ever heard in meetings: we tried that, it didn't work. And that seems to be the closing of that recommendation. When you are looking at taking that on again and saying, why didn't it work last time? That's where you need the recommendations and the areas for improvement. It's not about what happened day to day, and because that only stirs up the blame pot and the opportunity for blame to be thrown yet again. And we don't want that, because that's not going to fix it. That's not going to make it better the next time around. What we also talked about very briefly, and it's probably something I'll talk about a little bit more today, is about personal and professional integration. So transferring instincts. We often instinctively learn from our mistakes in our personal lives, but fail to transfer that same resilience and logic to the workplace. Labelling something as a failure can sometimes be an excuse to be lazy or irresponsible by avoiding the hard work of changing or improving. And both of those I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, because both of them very much relate to this example that I'm going to use. So what happened at the competition? The competition itself was, the staging days were the 24th and the 25th of March. So the 24th of March was an installation that had to be attached to a wall that was part of the display area. And on the other side of the wall was going to be the design that was staged the next day. The staging of the second design was only a 2-hour time frame, and it was while the show was open, and so there was going to be people walking past and potentially talking to you while you were trying to put the design together. So that had to be very structured, very organised, very focused on minimal amount of effort for the maximum impact of the design because of the potential interruptions that might happen. And for some of the competitors, it would be the first time that they had done that sort of a design staging whilst there was the general public walking through. It's not the first time I've done it, so in that sense I have learnt from doing that kind of design presentation previously. But the main side, the side that where the failure occurred, let's call it what it was, we had a day to do that, so about 8 hours and a little bit extra on the day before if we needed to. It had, as I said, it had to be attached to the wall. The other side had to be freestanding, but there had to be some visual connection between the two. Now the title was Kaleidoscope, and we were asked to not present it as a literal translation. And so my design was fragment to flow. So the longer design was on the fragment side, and the flow was the quick, easy one on the second side. Because it had to be attached to the wall, they sent us a diagram of what the wall looked like, but that didn't come until about a month before, maybe even less, maybe 3 weeks before the show. And it indicated an aspect that I wasn't expecting in terms of the staging size. So it's 2 metres by 2 metres, and 2.4 metres tall. There's a wall in the middle of that 2 metre by 2 metre section, but the design kind of indicated that one part of the wall wasn't all the way to the edge. And when I questioned that, it was yes, that's the case, so that people can see when they're walking past that it's two designs from out of the same interpretation. And I asked at that stage about the load bearing of the wall, because the drawing indicated that it was quite a thick wall, and I didn't see how that would, and that obviously flowed on to how much space we had to use on either side, and I didn't see why it needed to be so thick, the wall. I never got a result from them about what the load bearing was of the wall, and that was part of the problem that happened. I planned beforehand. I did a lot of planning, I did a lot of preparation, I did a lot of trial runs for the fragment side of the design. Got to Melbourne, so that meant that everything had to be flat packed and had to take it down. Got to the venue, started to put it together, was having a pretty successful time with the way it was coming together. 30 minutes before we had to be finished, ready for judging, it fell off the wall. Now, in 30 minutes, when you've spent 6.5 hours already putting it together, there's not a whole lot you can do. I did have, because in the planning stages I thought, well, if I don't know what the load bearing is, if I never hear about the load bearing, then perhaps I'm going to have to look at it being able to be freestanding, just in case, the just in case scenario. And so I was able to rebuild part of it so that it was freestanding. It was touching the wall, and I attached other things, other parts of the design to the wall rather than the structure that I had wanted on the wall. But what it lacked was the height that it needed for that particular design. So I knew in that moment that I was out of running for any of the prizes, any of the awards that were being given, because it simply wasn't a good enough design, and the connection between the other side probably wouldn't be as obvious because of that failure of that particular side. And so I put the other side together, and all things being equal, it came out. It was a good design. I'll put some photos up on the website so you can see. The disappointment for me was not so much that I was out of the awards, because I knew in that moment when it failed that there was no way I was going to be able to bring it back to what it needed to be to get an award at that level of design. It wasn't below the standard, but it certainly wasn't in the award levels of the standards that were being presented there. So I wasn't disappointed in that it had failed. I was disappointed in myself in that I hadn't pursued getting that information, and that I didn't have a better plan B to keep the height that I needed for that side of the design. And so that was a planning failure that on my part, but also a failure in terms of communication and responsibility that I needed to take to get the answers that I felt I needed for that particular activity. So if we look at that in terms of transferring that, bridging the gap between what instinctively I know and I have personal learning from in that environment, which is outside the work environment, obviously, to the workplace applications. What we need to look at, first of all, is redefining the failure. So the learning versus failure distinction. Rather than seeing the fallen design as a failure, I need to view it as a learning experience regarding the verification of external data and infrastructure. So exactly what I said in terms of my segue into this part of the revisiting the original podcast. I'll only fail if I approach the next competition with the same assumptions about organiser-provided diagrams and load-bearing specs. And so I have to recognise that I need to be stronger in getting the answers that I want. And what I also need to determine if the collapse was due to my skill set or extenuating circumstances, so in this case the inaccurate diagrams and the lack of communication from the organisers. And I think the collapse was not out of my control. If I'm brutally honest, I should have had it so that it was completely freestanding right up to the height that I needed in the event. You know, prepare for the worst case scenario, really, and I didn't do that. I thought about it beforehand, and I know I can see in my notes, in my notebook, that I've thought about having something that hung over the top of the wall so that I could get the height that I needed if it was going to be look like it was attached to the wall, but not actually attached to the wall. But even with that, I didn't pursue that idea. I just went back to the planning. I put it aside for whatever reason. I didn't pursue it, and that was a mistake as well. The real lesson for me here is that I need to get things clarified if the information provided seems insufficient or the physical reality of the site is unknown. So often, if we look at it in terms of a project, it's a new project, we haven't done it before, we need to have all of that information, even if it's information overload. We need to have absolutely everything we think we might possibly need so that we can have more than one plan for the activity that's going to happen. Despite the collapse, I presented a design that aligns with the idea of not being crippled by the fear of what others think or worry about being known as a failure. And I knew, I can remember my thought process in that moment when it came down. The only thing I said, because the people who were designing next to me heard the noise and looked across, and I just said to them, matter of factly, I've had a design failure. And one of the two that were there saying, oh, well, you just got to put it together as best you can and keep moving on. And that, I think, because they didn't fuss about it, you know, they were obviously focused on their own design. And because there wasn't there's disaster, I needed to move on quickly. And that helped me to move on quickly. So it was that acknowledge that it's happened. What are you going to do to make sure that something is presented, that you don't just walk away from it? Because in the past, I have done that. I have had a failure after 2 hours of putting a design together and it not standing up and falling over, and I have walked away and presented nothing, and that was the wrong thing to do in that instance. So I've learnt in that sense. I guess I have to look at it that way. It's better to have done something and presented a design, in this case for judging, than to have nothing at all because it wasn't 100% right. And so I have to take that on board and recognise that that is true, and that it gave the show visitors an opportunity to have a look at it. It was very different to the other designs, and so there was lots of photos taken and lots of interest in what I had presented, and I had a little spiel at the bottom of it about why the interpretation was that way, and I could see that people were reading it and then looking at the design. And so in that sense, I feel like I have contributed to the show rather than having it an empty spot where there was nothing there. What I need to do now is write all of this down. I need to document exactly what happened, what the outcome was, and what I learned regarding that wall-mounted design. And instead of dwelling on the disaster of the 30 minutes left before judging, I need to focus on the recommendations, like bringing independent load-bearing support or double verifying wall specs on the site. So the things that I've talked about that I should have done, I need to document, not try and just remember them. Oh, I should have done that last time and I should have done it this time. What I got out of that is just another reminder for you all that we don't transfer what we intrinsically know outside of the workplaces to our workplaces. Just as I need to check the wall, you need to learn to verify the load-bearing capacity of your internal infrastructure before launching a major initiative. What I think you need to do, and what I've learnt from this, is to move from my experience in all of those years of putting designs together to project thinking. I need to understand that I'm accountable, and that one of the things that I thought about later was that I felt like I was pestering the organisers for the information. But if I don't understand or I don't have the facts, I have to get them clarified rather than jumping in with assumptions. There is a document that I don't know whether I mentioned in the original podcast or not. It's written by Dan Sullivan, who's a quite well-known podcaster and businessman. And he talks about, he has a thing called the Experience Transformer, where you simply record what happened, what the outcome was. And so in this case, the design on the wall fell over. The outcome was that the design didn't flow as well as it should have into the other side of the design. And then you do your learning or recommendations. And from that, my learning is that I have to plan for the worst case scenario and have options in place ready to use at the last minute. Because often the projects that we're looking at in the workplace might not fail until close to the end. And that's when you feel like you've put all of this work in and it's just not going to work. What am I going to do next? And you get caught in that trap of inertia because there's just no way out that you can see clearly. Whereas if you've got a few plans B in place, then you do still have options. The reason that you record it is that it ensures whether it's you or whether it's another group that they don't need the whole disaster story. They just need the recommendations to ensure that a similar situation doesn't happen again. In the original episode, we suggested that when you admit that you know that we said we'd do this, it didn't work out, that the team and your staff and your peers see it as a learning exercise because of that verbalisation rather than a reason for criticism. They see the positive. It's a bit like, I know I talk a lot about when you say a sentence and you use but, however, or because in it, then people only hear what you say after that, not what was said before. So you always say the positive thing last rather than the negative, which is our default position. Even though the flow was lost on day 2 of this design, between the two designs, being open about the failure that caused it allows me and you, the audience, to understand that the process was not just lip service, that I really thought about it and that I tried to recover as best I could so that there was still something of the original plan there that needed to tell the story that I was trying to tell through this design. One of the things that I do want to focus on that I learned from this is about the trap of the instinctive veteran. So in the original episode, we warned that we often fail to transfer what we intrinsically and instinctively know into the workplace. So how do we look at that original Learning from Failure podcast and transfer it into the very different business environment that we've got these days? In the original conversation, the load-bearing walls of the corporate world, stable offices, predictable supply chains and human-only workflows, have now been replaced by more fluid, unpredictable variables. So what can we learn both from my exercise and from that original podcast and transfer into today's business environment? The first one is the trap of the instinctive veteran. Now, in the original episode, we warned that we often fail to transfer what we intrinsically and instinctively know into the workplace. In a stable environment, my 20-year sketchbook that I use for my planning has always worked. But in a world of AI and remote coordination, we need to treat every event as a formal project with structured records. And remote coordination was exactly what I was doing in this instance. We need to redefine failure in a shifting world. So Fuliana talked about failure only truly occurs if you do exactly the same thing and exactly the same way and expect a different result. In 2026, the same way often no longer exists because of the external factors, like in my example, the organiser's accuracy or the technical specs that are constantly shifting. And so once again, it's that work environment that is very different to what it was in 2018. In the original podcast, we highlighted the dangers of not reading something before you press send in an email or acting on unclarified information. In a hybrid or AI integrated workplace where communication is often asynchronous, pestering for reality is no longer an annoyance. It's a risk mitigation requirement, and that's something that I didn't look at carefully enough, that I didn't pester. I thought that I was being too I guess in some ways I thought I was being too unprofessional by continuing to ask questions, that I should have known some of these things, but that isn't the case because this is not a competition that I've entered previously. I've certainly visited the show on a number of occasions and done display designs, but not competition designs. Now, we have had guests and we have talked ourselves about CEOs who worried that teams were not making enough mistakes because they were being too cautious. And today, the risk isn't just making a mistake, it's being too daunted to challenge the flawed data provided by massive organisations or systems. And that's exactly the trap that I fell into. I was daunted by the organisers by thinking that they were professional. They are professional event organisers. They're not inured in the world of floral design and floral art competitions, and so I had flawed data that I didn't question, and that falls back to me being a bit more insistent on the communication, on the answers, and on having a plan B, C and D when I might not have got the answers in a timely fashion. The original podcast, we emphasised that we should record what happened and what the outcome was and what we learned, so that the next team or the future self has clear recommendations. In a work-from-home environment where social cues are limited to the written word or Zoom meetings or summaries of meetings, closure is critical. What we need to ensure is that when a project doesn't go as planned, the blame isn't carried forward, but the learning is celebrated. And so that's where I am at the moment, is that I'm trying not to carry the blame forward, but I'm focusing more and more on the learning and on the fact that I had the opportunity to put the design together. I participated in a competition that I have wanted to participate in for as long as I've been doing floral art, that I was selected to do that I put a design up despite the challenges. I put a design up for the public to see and to be reinforced that my design skills were at the level of all of these other people who had been selected to compete. In summary, because I know I've been talking for a while and I appreciate that you've continued to listen, experience is a platform, not a safety net. In a business world reshaped by remote work and shifting technical landscapes, the load-bearing walls we once relied on may no longer be stable. So, what are the key points that we need to remember in terms of the necessity of continual learning and rigorous review in our work environments? Overcoming the veteran's trap, first of all. We often fail to transfer what we instinctively know from our personal lives, like the need to verify directions or physical stability, into our professional project management. True failure is defined as doing exactly the same thing over and over while expecting a different result. Avoiding this requires constant evolution of our methods and our processes. Even with decades of expertise, treating a task as a new project with a structured record rather than relying on past sketches prevents oversight and ensures planning is based on current reality. Across the board, we have to view every situation as fraught with the possibility of a mistake and prioritise the ability to move on and learn, as failing to do that leaves us in a black hole of mere existence. And I think that's where businesses will begin to fail in this new business environment that we face. It's the judgmental aspect that is the wrong culture. You've got to celebrate the learning from failure, not condemn it. I'll leave you with that to think about. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Inside Exec.